Good evening, everybody. Are you here? The sacred land on which we meet today has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I know it's a slight variation from that, but it's more or less the same sentiment. Anyway, welcome to the 2018 Harold Innis Lecture. My name is Sitaram Kalawan Singh, and I have the privilege of chairing the board of the Harold Innis Foundation. And we are co-sponsoring tonight's lecture with Innis College and the History Students Association. Since the foundation was established 49 years ago, it's supported a scholarship program and various discussions about the ideas of Harold Innis. And as you can probably figure it out, this college is named after Harold Innis. And we revived this lecture program 2 years ago when George Eliot Clark, some of you may have been here, spoke about Leonard Cohen. And last year, Andrew Coyne discussed the health of journalism, and tonight's lecture will be given by Charlotte Gray, who will be introduced more fulsomely by Jeffrey Taylor, who is the director of the Toronto International Festival of Authors. And I can tell you who next year's lecturer is, and that will be Dion Brand, another award-winning author. So I'd like to acknowledge members of the Innis College Council who are here and the Harold Innis Foundation. Some of them are sitting in this front row here, front 3 rows here. I'd also like to thank the History Students Association for their support, as well as the Toronto International Festival of Authors. And in particular, I'd like to thank 2 individuals. Annis Blentic, who's sitting right here, who's the past chair of the Harold Innis Foundation, and also the advancement officer for Innis College. I'm sure many of you have spoken to him about your donations to the college. And of course, the secretary of the foundation is Ben Westrade, who's been the one communicating with all of you about tonight's lecture. So let me just quickly tell you what the plan for tonight will be. And to minimize me getting up and down, I'm just going to tell you what the program is, and everybody knows their job, and hopefully they'll do it. But I'll be sitting right there so I can intervene if necessary, but I don't think so. So, because Innis believes very strongly in the principle of student parity, we've involved some students in tonight's program. So Joel Colby, who's a student, who was a student here at Innis and is still connected to Innis, and Joel is the vice chair of the Harold Innis Foundation, and he will introduce Professor Peter Russell. Unfortunately, Charlie, or maybe fortunately, because he's in Czechoslovakia, is having a good time, we hope. Charlie Cobb, the principal of Innis College, couldn't be here tonight, so what do? We find one of the most brilliant former principals, Peter Russell, to give the official college welcome. Following Professor Russell's remarks and welcome, Jeffrey Taylor will introduce tonight's guest and moderate the questions and answers after the lecture. And I'll tell you a little bit about Jeffrey in a sec. And after Jeffrey, Alice Liu, who is also a student here at Innis College, will extend appreciation to our guest, and then we'll have a party, as in there's alcohol and some food, and books will be available for sale by a U of T bookstore, and our guest lecturer, Charlotte, is available to sign books. So if you don't have the book, I'm sure, or any of her books, I'm sure that after you've heard her tonight, you will most definitely want to have one of Charlotte's books in your collection. So just before I hand the mic over to Joel to introduce Professor Russell, let me tell you a little bit about Jeffrey Taylor. Jeffrey has been a key player with the Toronto International Festival of Authors for about 30 years. As the festival's director for the past 15, he travels the world bringing the world's leading authors to Toronto, as well as promoting Canadian literature abroad. He's a founding member of Word Alliance, which is an alliance of 8 major international literary festivals. And Quillen Choir, which is an important organ in the literary community, named him one of the 30 most influential people in Canadian publishing, which is not to say he's going to get one of your books published, but he's very influential, but you can talk to him about that. Anyway, Jeffrey was the inaugural recipient of the Order of the Forest, presented by a consortium of environmental activist groups for his extraordinary contribution towards building an ancient forest-friendly book publishing community. He holds an honorary degree from the Humber Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. And most recently, actually about a year ago, the Republic of France has conferred of him the distinguished honor of Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, Knight in the Order of Knights and Letters, so I guess we have to call him Sir Geoffrey. So without further ado, Joe, will you come and do the honors?
Thank you, Sita, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Joel Colby, and I'm the Vice President of the Harold Innis Foundation. It's a great honor to introduce Peter Russell this evening, who will be issuing our official welcome on behalf of Innis College. Peter is an alumnus of the University of Toronto Schools, Trinity College at the University of Toronto, and Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. He taught political science at the University of Toronto from 1958 to 1997. As Sita mentioned, Peter is especially important to us here at Innis College, as he was our former principal from 1973 to 1978, and also a founding board member of the Harold Innis Foundation. Peter is widely regarded as an expert in the fields of constitutional, Aboriginal, and judicial politics. He was the Director of Research for the Macdonald Commission on the RCMP, a member of the Federal Task Force on Comprehensive Land Claims, President of the Canadian Political Science Association, and Chair of the Research Advisory Committee for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. He's the author of several books, including Two Cheers for Minority Government, The Evolution of Canadian Parliamentary Democracy, Constitutional Odyssey, Can Canadians Become a Sovereign People, Recognizing Aboriginal Title, The Mabo Case, and Indigenous Resistance to English Settler Colonialism, and his most recent book, Canada's Odyssey, a country based on incomplete conquest, which we were fortunate enough to have the book launch here at Innis College just last year. He's an officer of the Order of Canada, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and past chairman of the Churchill Society for the Advancement of Parliamentary Democracy. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Peter Russell.
It's great to be introduced by a student vice president of a foundation. Harold Innis would love it. Wonderful to see such a fine turnout for this lecture tonight. I was, as being explained, the second principal of Innis College, and 49 years ago, it was just 49 years ago. See, I started my principalship in 71. My secretary said, "There's someone here to see you, Peter." We were then down on 63 St. George Street. His name is Sam Innis. And in came Sam Innis, Harold's older brother. He'd taken off his overalls and his plaid shirt and got all dressed up for the city. He'd come in from Otterville. And he came to tell me that he and his wife were getting on and they weren't going to be able to look after the farm where he and his brother Harold had grown up. And would I like to buy it? I said, sure. We're going to have to raise some money. So my next call was someone you all know, Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall he didn't lose a beat. He just said, we're going to do that, Peter. And we did. We founded a foundation, the Harold Innis Foundation. Right away, he was the first chairman. Your first chairman of your foundation. He did a great job, and we bought the Innis family farm at Otterville. For his first 10 or 15 years, it was a place for students to go for conferences and other people. It was a conference center. Beside the old farmhouse, we built a modern conference center. Very simple, a lot of glass windows looking out on the fields, carpets on the floor, bean bag chairs invented by an Innis student who made millions from doing it. No chairs, and we had a ball there for a while. And student interest changed, so foundation adapted and moved on, sold the farm, and put money into scholarship and events like this and the research side. And I think, if I can be so bold to say that, I think Harold Innis would be proud of where we've been. He'd be fascinated with this topic tonight, Charlotte, because his message was we were losing the oral tradition. We creatures of print and writing and everything else, and he was so aware of that at the university. So storytelling, he would be fascinated. So thank you for being our speaker, and thank you all for coming. Welcome to Innis College.
This is where I tell you that I've never done this before. I've actually moderated twice before, but this will be the first time I've ever done it in Canada. So no pressure. When Sita called me and said that she wanted me to do this evening, I was ready to say no, and then she told me it was for Charlotte, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to jump at that opportunity. I've of course known Charlotte for a very long time. She's been on our stage numerous times at the festival, and of course, as it was mentioned, I've been doing this for a very long time. So for those of you that in this room who have not had the opportunity to read any of her 10 acclaimed books of literary nonfiction, including her most recent bestseller, The Promise of Canada, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country, or her other award-winning books, including The Massey Murder, Reluctant Genius, The Alexander Graham Bell and the Passion for Invention, and Gold Diggers, Striking It Rich and the Klondike. You might have had the opportunity to learn about her work through other platforms. For example, Gold Diggers was the basis of both a U.S. Discovery Channel docudrama and a PBS documentary. And Sisters of the Wilderness, which Charlotte published in 1999, was named one of the most 25 influential books in Canada in the past 25 years by the Literary Review of Canada. And it was also made into a docudrama by the CBC. Might ask her about this later, but Charlotte was also the celebrity advocate for Sir John A. Macdonald on CBC, who's the greatest Canadian. And we wonder if he still has a statue somewhere to him. If that didn't keep her busy enough, Charlotte is also active within the creative community. She has chaired the boards of both Canada's National History Society and the Art Canada Institute. She has served on numerous boards, including PEN Canada and the Ottawa International Writers Festival. She's been on numerous committees, including the Writers' Trust, juror members for things like the Scotia Taylor Prize, the RBC Taylor Prize, the City of Ottawa Book Prize, several CBC Award prizes. Born in Sheffield, educated at Oxford University and the London School of Economics, Charlotte worked as a political commentator, book reviewer, magazine columnist before she turned to biography and popular history. She's currently an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. She holds 5 honorary degrees, is a member of the Order of Canada, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She currently lives in Ottawa. Charlotte Gray is one of Canada's best-known biographers and writers of popular history. Her ability to provide original and intriguing entry points into Canadian history has earned her a large and faithful readership. Love the way you all was staring at me. This is great. Maybe I will do this more often. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Charlotte Gray.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that terrific introduction. You should do it more often. Talent wasted. Thank you, Sita, for inviting me to give this talk tonight. And I'm really honoured to do the Harold Innis Lecture. Thank you, Innis, for making it the most pleasurable trip to Toronto for me from my home in Ottawa. And thank you all for coming out. I know that it's living in Toronto, you have so many opportunities to do so many fascinating things that I was just blown away when I turned around a few minutes ago and realized how many people were here. It's a little intimidating. Telling stories in the age of historical amnesia. It's such a sexy title. How can I ever live up to it? I had such a good time thinking of the title. It's one of those deals where then, 2 months later, I had to actually think about what I was going to say. And I'm going to describe to you something that I have been thinking about for quite a long time. I arrived in this country, I know you probably wouldn't guess it from my accent, but I wasn't born here. And I've spent, ever since I arrived here nearly 40 years ago, thinking about what makes this country different. And there's nothing like having a standard of comparison because you were born elsewhere. I started this process of thinking about Canada and what holds together this vast land, which covers 5 time zones and includes 1/5 of the globe's freshwater resources. This is a vast country. I started thinking about it when I began writing my book. I started thinking particularly about it and really focusing what I'd been doing for the previous decades. When I began writing my last book, The Promise of Canada, which was prompted by the 150th anniversary of Confederation in 1867. And I began to read at that point about how this country came together back then and how it has changed over the intervening years. And of course, it's stunning. These changes have been so dramatic and could so easily have capsized a less robust construction. But here we are in a country that has not just survived, it has actually thrived. But as I went through this process, I was intrigued by the stories that Canadians, and here I am talking particularly about English-speaking Canadians, have told themselves, have told ourselves about this country's origins. And by the way, these stories have morphed from generation to generation. Now, today we do acknowledge that there have been some very ugly patches in our past. We're only just starting to come to terms with some of the appalling injustices meted out to particular groups. Successive governments have apologized for incidents, including, among others, the Chinese head tax in the early 20th century, the exclusion of Sikh refugees from Canada in the Komagatu Maru incident in 1914, the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, the treatment by the federal government of LGBTQ2 employees, and I could go on with the list. We had an apology today. And most notably, of course, for the residential school system, which more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children attended between the 1840s and 1996. We can't rewrite history, although we can and should apologize and pay compensation where appropriate. But we can recognize that our predecessors did live in a world that's radically different from ours, different in ideologies, challenges, constraints, and goals. We can also acknowledge that the stories that we tell ourselves, stories about how this country began, what holds it together, whose voices should be heard, have shifted over time. There is no single correct history. But historical knowledge does allow us to see patterns. It also reminds us not to be too arrogant. The stories that we are concocting in 2018 will also be superseded at some point. This is one of my favourite contrasts. The Cree artist Kent Monkman has brilliantly captured on canvas, on the right, the clash between different versions of the past. On the left, that iconic image of the Fathers of Confederation that's a mainstay still of school textbooks in English Canada. On the right, Monkman's more contemporary reading, with an ambiguously gendered but clearly Indigenous figure on a Hudson Bay blanket confronting the fathers. Every country has creation myths, often involving revolutions, military victories, or empires, which have morphed over time. And during my childhood in England, I was nurtured on a steady diet of military and naval triumphs. The Norman Conquest, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the Battle of Waterloo, etc. And they all involved tremendous loss of life and victory. Canada's origin stories are more subtle. There isn't a bloodthirsty creation myth. Yet there are plenty of creation stories here, starting, of course, with Indigenous origin beliefs, such as the Haudenosaunee story of Turtle Island. This story dominated the north-central part of this continent for hundreds of years, before first French, then British settlers arrived and started talking about Canada. Until this generation, though, most non-Indigenous Canadians wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about if you mentioned Turtle Island. That story was just not part of most people's education, most non-Indigenous people's education. But that story has always held and continues to have a profound hold on Indigenous peoples in this area. So what I'd like to do this evening is to talk about two particular Canadian creation stories that non-Indigenous Canadians embraced, one from the 19th century and one from the 20th century. And I'm going to explore these two origin stories through the lives of two particular individuals, separated from each other by gender, background, and a century of turmoil. And the first person I'm going to talk about is someone who I've always felt a great similarity with, because like me, she was an immigrant from England to this continent, and somebody that I have always enjoyed writing about. Here she is, Suzanne Moody, on the left of this picture, with her sister Catherine Partrail on the right, two women who played a significant role in establishing the literary tradition in Canada. Susanna Moody was born Susanna Strickland. She was the youngest in a large, well-educated upper-middle-class family and grew up in Suffolk in an Elizabethan manor house. And almost certainly, she had exactly the same kind of creation story thrust at her as I had, the one I've already mentioned. The Battle of Waterloo, the Norman Conquest. She was determined from a young age to be a writer. 4 of her 5 sisters also became writers. But for the Stricklands, the wolf was never far from the door. And then as now, it was hard to make a living from your pen, and there was no family money. She was doing quite well, contributing to magazines and journals, when into her life stepped a boisterous Orkneyman named John Moody. Marriage and a baby quickly followed. The Moodys struggled to make ends meet, and as a half-pay officer, John Moody was entitled to free land in British North America, so in 1832, the young couple set sail for Upper Canada. Okay, so what were they coming to? What did Susanna think that Upper Canada was going to be like? Well, the first thing that happened was that she had a 9-week nightmare journey of squalls, storms, and thick fog off Newfoundland's Outer Banks. Emigration was not starting as a happy experience. Susanna assumed, though, that she was coming to an outpost of Britain that wouldn't be so different from the land that she'd left behind, because the colony rested firmly on British laws and traditions. British currency circulated. The monarch back in Britain appointed the lieutenant governor, who ran Upper Canada. Lawyers trained at British universities administered its laws. The Anglican Church wielded enormous influence on colonial affairs. She expected to join a society of gentlemen farmers. She hoped that her children would have more opportunities in the New World than they had in Britain. She she was in for a very rude shock. This is what she found. But first, even before she got into the backwoods and found she had to start building a cabin, she and her fellow passengers had arrived below Quebec City at Grosse Ile Quarantine Station, and she had watched a huge, wild-eyed Irishman flourishing a shillelagh and wearing only a tattered greatcoat, shrieking, "Wirra, my boys! Sure, we'll all be gentlemen." Social hierarchies with which she had grown up and that she had never questioned in Britain didn't operate here. Life in Upper Canada challenged many of her basic assumptions about class, about culture, about women's roles. The society in which she now found herself was entirely different from the social circles in which she'd moved in Suffolk and London. Although British accents predominated, there were plenty of Yankees around, and Suzanne Moody did not like Yankees. She was certainly not the first Canadian to be anti-American. Interestingly, she was more sympathetic to the Anishinaabe peoples, Peter Nogan and Mrs. Peter, who would silently appear from time to time close to her cabin. She had good reason to be very grateful to them. During the bitter winters, her Indigenous neighbours would quietly leave fish on her doorstep to ensure she and her 5 children didn't starve. But for Suzanne Moody, emigration was exile from everything she held dear. Establishing a farm in the wilderness was much, much harder than either she or her husband had ever expected. In the years ahead, England would always be home. Her memoir of life in the bush is a compelling story of one crisis after another. There's Roughing It in the Bush on the left, and there's the book I wrote about her and her sister, Sisters in the Wilderness. But throughout all the trials and tribulations of Roughing It in the Bush, and the Moody's subsequent move to Belleville, Suzanne Moody saw the story of Canada as a British story. Yes, the colonies had achieved a degree of self-government, the colonies in British North America. But for her and most of her English-speaking fellow immigrants, these colonies, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, were as much part of Britain as, say, the Orkney Islands, where her husband came from. But Canada changed Susanna. For one thing, while living close to what is now Lakefield, she learned skills she would never have acquired back in Suffolk, including how to bake bread, boil maple syrup, and survive in the backwoods. She also learned to paddle a canoe and experience a landscape that was far more dramatic than anything she'd seen back home. She realized this was a different country. There's a wonderful description that she gives of paddling with her husband John from Lake Cachewanuka into Clear Lake and then Stony Lake, just near Lakefield. She wrote, "Oh, what a magnificent scene of wild and lonely grandeur burst upon us as we swept around the island, the little peninsula, and the whole majesty of Stony Lake broke upon us." She came to believe that the lack of a rigid class system might be a strength for the colony. It would allow a real meritocracy to develop. And she persuaded herself that, quote, "the want of education and moral training is the only real barrier that exists between the different classes of men." She realized this was a country with a different story. Now, she was in her mid-60s and living in Belleville when the British North American Act was passed in 1867, establishing the Dominion of Canada. The new federation of former colonies, 4 in the year of Confederation, but 7 by the time of her death in 1885, was a bold new form of government. But it wasn't very exciting. Confederation did not owe its birth to a lust for independence among the colonists. It came about largely because the United States of America, emerging from its own civil war, was casting covetous eyes north, and because Westminster was about to withdraw its military support for the colonists across the Atlantic. Confederation didn't have the ring of a great creation myth, since it was built on a legal compromise between English-speaking and French-speaking political leaders. No blood was shed, and the existence of the country's indigenous peoples was barely recognized. As far as I know, the birth of the Dominion had no impact on Moody fortunes. Susanna never made any public comments on what happened in 1867. She was too busy with family concerns. In any case, the new Dominion remained tightly linked to the imperial centre 5,000 kilometres away. And for most of the English-speaking residents of post-1867 Canada, Confederation was strictly a political deal. For French-speaking residents of the new Dominion, it was an even more bloodless bit of constitutional tinkering. Georges-Étienne Cartier spoke of Canadians sharing, quote, a political nationality rather than a linguistic, ethnic, or cultural nationality. In Cartier's time, this was a subtle promise to Quebecers that their uniqueness, their culture, language, law, religion, was now constitutionally protected. Now today, this notion of political nationality is, in the words of Richard Gwynne, part of Canada's DNA. It's something we're proud of because it's something that allows us to absorb many different peoples. But at the time, it was a way of buying French-Canadian support for the deal. And for most of those English-speaking Canadians in 1867, Britain remained the motherland. This was true of both recent British immigrants like Suzanne Moody or United Empire loyalists who had moved north after the American Revolution because they wanted to remain under the crown. For Canadians outside Quebec, the new Dominion was held together by its British roots. For the next few decades, when Ontario children were not learning about British monarchs in their school readers, they were absorbing the idea that the story of Canada was all about great men in stovepipe hats making a deal in Charlottetown that preserved British parliamentary institutions, institutions that had evolved through centuries of British history. Loyalty to the British Crown was key. So the birth story for Canada in the late 19th century told of a triumphant political deal that guaranteed peace, order, and government, and a continued British character. That was the story most English-speaking Canadians chose to tell themselves. Back then, that was our story. But that version of the national tale didn't last. As close ties with Britain, the motherland, began to fray, so an incurred desire grew on this side of the Atlantic for a new frame for this country's past. A distinct Canadian identity had begun to germinate, as in fact Suzanne Moody had anticipated when she started talking about a meritocratic society. But there was still not much to work with here. No flag, no national anthem, no military heroes. But fears of being swallowed up by Uncle Sam had evaporated, and in the early 20th century, the population of Canada was exploding, thanks to immigration, and the economy was doing well. And a unique culture had begun to develop. Canadian artists stopped trying to paint like Europeans and strove to capture the Canadian landscape. That meant fewer cows and more trees. Now, I'm not going to exaggerate what was going on. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, ties to the motherland tautened and Canada signed on. English-Canadian loyalty to Britain was solid. Thousands of young men from Vancouver to Halifax rushed to enlist. But now I'm going to introduce a man who fought in the trenches of World War I and then came home to reshape the way historians framed the story of this country. He also, of course, played a crucial role in the development of the University of Toronto. His contribution to this country's intellectual life was recognized in 1964 when this college was founded and named after him. Now, as Peter mentioned, Harold Innis was born on a 100-acre farm in southwest Ontario near Woodstock in Otterdale to parents whose families had arrived from Scotland several generations earlier. Alongside his siblings, he grew up performing routine farm chores, collecting eggs, boiling sap, weeding around turnips, erecting fences. But he was a bright boy, and his parents made many sacrifices to send him to high school. After high school, he took the train out west to teach in a tiny community in northern Alberta called Vermilion. journey, like Susanna's glimpse of Stony Lake when she went paddling, gave him a glimpse of the vast spaces and regional differences in a country that, at the point when Innis went out west, it was so new that it still hadn't celebrated its 50th birthday. Innis went on to McMaster University, and then as soon as he graduated in 2016, he enlisted. The transition from super bright, super hardworking student to weary, mud-spattered foot soldier was swift and demoralizing. As a new recruit, he was drilled by British officers whose overt contempt for colonials he found intolerable. And he was overwhelmed by the tedium of war. By now, he was an artillery signaller in the trenches of northern France. He wrote home that he was, quote, working in mud, sleeping in mud, and eating mud. Perhaps it was boredom that persuaded him to volunteer for one of the most dangerous jobs on the front. He joined a handful of spotters who, at the dead of night, crawled across the bleak landscape of barbed wire, dead bodies, and ditches to check out enemy installations. They were spotted. A German shell exploded, and Innis felt a searing pain in his leg as shrapnel tore into the flesh and blood that gushed from his right thigh. In fact, a second piece of shrapnel would have pierced a lung if he hadn't had a notebook lodged in his rucksack. And this is actually in the Thomas Fisher Rare Books Library. Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. You can see the notebook there with the pierced by the shrapnel. And as I say, taking notes can save your life. In some ways, Innis was lucky. He'd scored a blighty, as the wounds were called, that were serious enough to allow him to escape the front, but not life-threatening. This is the postcard that his parents back in Ontario received, one of the regulation First World War postcards that were sent from soldiers who'd been wounded. I just don't think it could have been in the least bit reassuring for his parents. I looked at it, and at one point I thought there must be somewhere you can tick where it says, I am dead. Because I have been admitted into hospital, wounded, and I'm going on well. Letter follows at first opportunity. Can you imagine being the parent who received that letter? But he was going to be safe. He went to a military hospital in the south of England, and there he brooded over what he should do next. He asked himself, what impact should all that bloody carnage have on his own future and the future of his country? He had been horrified by the senseless carnage, the manipulation of public opinion by government propaganda, and the British assumptions that the colonials had arrived to defend the empire, not their own countries or their own values. Now he began to think that Canada should focus on itself rather than scrambling to serve Britain's needs. He wrote, quote, work of brain and of brawn, cooperation, organization, and determination to heal the sores, and to start again along the lines of sound national progress is the hope of the Canadian people, that she may take her place among the nations of the world for the privilege of which her best blood had been shed. So Innis came home, went to the University of Chicago to study economics, ended up at the University of Toronto with a lectureship in economics. His ambition? To write an economic history of Canada that would explain Canada to both the outside world and to Canadians. He'd published many books of groundbreaking research, but the most important, and the one that has lasted, is The Fur Trade in Canada, which appeared in 1930. The fur trade in Canada was the result of years of what Innis liked to call dirt research. His dirt research consisted of summers spent exploring as many of Canada's great rivers, the Peace River, the Mackenzie, the Yukon, as he could manage. And his favorite means of transport was the canoe. Innis's central argument was that there was an economic cohesion to Canada that predated Confederation by 3 centuries. The land that would come to be called Canada had been exporting its primary products, especially furs, to Europe for 400 years. What had allowed this trade to flourish had been the great rivers that flowed east-west or west-east. These had been the trade routes, and they had knit the northern half of North America together. Innis described the gradual push westward by fur traders. He acknowledged the crucial roles played by indigenous guides, trappers, and middlemen. In the early 19th century, demand for beaver pelts was replaced by demand for another Canadian staple, lumber. Enormous rafts of fresh-cut logs now floated down Canada's rivers. East-west trade along these waterways, argued Innis, had drawn the diverse regions of northern North America into a single economic network, from Labrador to the Alaska border. 4 centuries of intensive trade and labor had produced modern Canada, not a few years of constitutional negotiation in the 1860s triggered by loyalty to British institutions. He made a dramatic announcement. Quote, "The present Dominion emerged not in spite of geography, but because of it." In the 1930s, English Canadians were ready to hear a new version of their history. The remaining political links with Britain were being quietly severed, and a new national self-consciousness was flowering. They wanted a new story. In the newly founded Canadian Forum, Innis was praised for rescuing Canadian history from, quote, "those badly overworked heroes, the French Catholic Church and the United Empire Loyalists. Our political historians have practically neglected all those internal forces in the colony which have given Canadian civilization what distinctive concrete qualities it possesses." Innis had refashioned the national story, making the country's powerful rivers and boreal forests the central theme, rather than the journey from colony to nation. And Canadians embraced this new way of looking at their national identity. Other historians soon challenged his argument, and meanwhile the country continued to evolve. Cities exploded with people, and the lure of the wild faded. Western Canada grew in political heft, and after the 1970s, new immigration laws began to change the ethnic composition of the Canadian population. This second version of the Canadian story, Innis's version, based on geography, was solely replaced again because new stories about this country emerged, stories threaded through with words like multiculturalism and diversity. The next generation assessed the past from yet another perspective. And today we learn stories about Canada as a country that has always been characterized by diversity, even if important elements in this frame, Indigenous peoples, were consciously ignored or worse. Constant reassessment, new stories, it's good. The stories that prevailed in the past are due for a rethink regularly. Canada today has been shaped by the rights revolution, changing demographics, feminism, greater respect for different cultures, rejection of racist ideologies. We need to ask questions of the past, not just what happened, but also what people back then chose to believe about themselves and their country. But are we conducting these debates in a balanced fashion? Let's start with the recent shredding of Sir John A. Macdonald's reputation. There are proposals that his name should be removed from Ontario public schools. The Canadian Historical Association's prestigious Macdonald Award has been rebranded as a prize for, quote, the best scholarly book in Canadian history. Last summer, statues of Macdonald in Regina and Montreal were defaced. Victoria City Council went so far as to cart its statue of Macdonald away on a flatbread truck. Macdonald's offence is his role in the residential school system, a deplorable system, but it was a system that had been established before he became Prime Minister, peaked about 40 years after his death, and continued under 18 more Prime Ministers before the last school finally closed in 1996. As the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reported, the system was a catastrophe for Canada's Indigenous peoples. Their children were horrifically abused, their cultures destroyed, their communities shattered. Yet the issue, I would argue, is not who to blame, but how did this happen? How can we understand the past, where people acted in ways that today we consider shocking? Instead of rushing to judgment in a triumphant display of wokeness, what about widening the perspective to see what was actually going on back there? What about understanding the stories that Canadians chose to tell themselves back then about how this country began and what it stood for? So this is where Sir John A. Macdonald stood, outside Victoria City Hall, before his ignominious fall from grace. But as I watched TV clips of Victoria's statue being carted away, I noticed a ridiculous irony. Fixed to the wall on the other side of the doors of City Hall was the city's coat of arms. It's laden with colonial symbols. 2 blonde angels represent colonization and civilization, while Christian symbols, including a dove of peace and a crusader helmet, are also in there. As if the name of British Columbia's capital and the Union Jack embedded in the provincial flag weren't enough, this coat of arms hints that the British Empire lives on. The coat of arms belongs to the world in which Macdonald grew up, a world where Britain was the motherland, Christian evangelism was used to justify oppression, and now discredited theories of racial hierarchies held sway. Against this background, Sir John A. moulded a handful of shabby British colonies into a new country and built a coast-to-coast railway across the continent to bind it together. He was a man of his time, but he propelled the new dominion towards autonomy. Without Macdonald, would there even have been a Canada? The Fathers of Confederation developed a radical new idea on which to establish this country, a compromise between English-speaking and French-speaking settlers. The idea of a nation based on political rather than ethnic links has allowed Canada to become the beacon of pluralism that our current Prime Minister loves to celebrate. So decisions made yesterday underpin the narrative that is popular today. Meanwhile, in a province with some of the largest non-settler, non-Christian communities in the country, the capital's coat of arms continues to portray peachy-cheeked angels in crusader armour. I can't help wondering why our first Prime Minister had to be banished from Victoria's City Council while a bunch of outdated symbols are still allowed to tell their story of white supremacy and racial bigotry. As I hope I've demonstrated, the stories we tell ourselves have changed over the years, and future generations will tell new stories. The next generation is already berating ours for our wanton destruction of the environment, for our needless cruelty to family farmed animals, for our blind embrace of consumerism. Will tomorrow's Canadians make the effort to understand why, at the turn of the 20th century, those issues had not been written into the national story? If we want the future to respect the stories we tell ourselves about this country today, we must respect the narratives of previous generations, even as we debate their legacies. And that means going easy on the finger wagging. That way, we not only dispel our historical amnesia, we also get better stories. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Pink for a girl.
Before we begin, I want to point out to the audience that I gave the short version of your bio. So there's lots more things I could add, but I'm going to add a couple of things. You've been a long list of awards. You've been nominated for numerous book prizes. You have excellent handwriting, which I know because you've sent me lovely notes. And in our correspondence we've had recently, you also told me that your ultimate ambition was to have a good tennis backhand. So hopefully that will come up later. Some of the things you talked about were things I was going to ask you about, but I might skip over some of those things. And I'm sure the audience later is going to have some even better questions that I'm going to come up with. I should hold the microphone more clearly. So in your talk at the beginning, you mentioned that you were born in Sheffield and you were educated in the UK, and you talked a bit about that. So after that, obviously the next progression is an interest in Canadian history. So perhaps you could connect the dots a bit for me there.
Well, when I arrived in Canada, I was already sort of on the path of being a writer. I'd been editing a magazine in England, and I moved to Canada because I met a Canadian. And the embarrassing thing is, he said, come to Ottawa because it's the capital of Canada, and so there'll be lots of magazines you can write there. And winter's only 6 weeks long. Anyway, I married the liar, and but I discovered that the only thing that magazines, none of which were published in Ottawa, they're all in Toronto, were interested in was politics. So I very quickly started writing magazine articles about federal politics and doing profiles of ministers and trying to understand issues. And it didn't take me very long to realize that I could wing it for just so long that I actually didn't know what I was writing about, that I really needed to understand who are all these MPs and ministers? Where do they come from? What is their part of the country like? What are their stories? How does this country work? And so at that point I realized that I needed, in fact, to stop looking just at the sort of surface everyday events of Ottawa politics and do a bit of history. And this suited me just fine because I'd studied history at university. I love history. But I'd studied it way back when, long before it had become a social science, which is what it's happened to history in the last 40 years or so, when it was still at Oxford considered a literary art. So actually it was just a joy to start writing about Canadian history in terms of its narrative strength and marry together the extraordinary stories of this country and some kind of analysis of what it means today.
Thank you. I must confess I didn't know a lot about Harold Innis until I was asked to do this, and I did a bit of Googling as people do and whatnot. And of course, over the last few days, I've had the opportunity to speak to some of the people involved with this and find out some more things. But why do you think Harold Innis is not as well known as maybe he should be?
Well, in fact, I think we should probably ask Peter this question, but I know that one of the reasons it's always said that Innis is not as well known as he should be is that his writing was absolutely impenetrable. In fact, actually, the fur trade of Canada is that an easy read, but he was in such a hurry he was brilliant, and he was in such a hurry to accumulate as much information as he needed to justify his increasingly complex arguments as he moved on to other staples other than fur. He also wrote about fish, and he then moved into communications theory, and he would just sort of do a data dump of information onto the pages and write very fast. And I think there was one review of his work that said Professor Innis has the ability to grab incomprehensibility from the jaws of legibility. And the irony now that the sort of dust has settled on a lot of that is that increasingly people say, well, everything that Marshall McLuhan wrote, he actually just listened very closely and was an admirer of his colleague Innis, and he actually made it comprehensible to most of us. Now, I'm sure there are going to be people in this audience who know far more than me and are going to challenge that. But the question is, why is Innis not well known? And I think it's because people can't read him.
This is a really broad question, but why should we care about history today? It doesn't seem to do much with our contemporary society we're living in. It's a loaded question, I know that.
I don't know where to begin with that question because I would like
Well, how
to
about if I
actually
frame it
challenge every single assumption in it. Why should we care about history? Because this country's history is unique, because it's the way that this country has developed is what the underpinning of our politics, our culture, our society today. I agree, actually, that most people do question what the value of history today is. But it's largely because most of us get so little opportunity to actually know any of it. It's not taught in schools. In schools, you know, half the provinces in Canada don't have Canadian history as a high school course. You can emerge from high school in most provinces with knowing nothing about Canadian history. If you're not taught it in school, why should you think it was important? But it is important, because every time you think, well, why isn't a pipeline being built from Alberta to British Columbia? Or why do we have 10 provinces? Or what's the difference between a province and a territory? Or any one of it, you know, the simplest questions about today's Canada. You have to discover when those decisions were made and why they were taken at the time.
So the question I was thinking about, I was sitting here when I was listening to you talk and referring to the 150th anniversary of Confederation. And I noticed those choice of words because when the 150 rolled around, it was always being called birthday. And I think the reality in '67 was very front that it was anniversary of Confederation and not our birthday. And this last go around, we seem to have missed that part out a bit.
You mean there wasn't much joy?
Well, no, well, there was that too, but I mean, the idea that more people were saying it was the 150th birthday of Canada, not the 150th of acknowledging of the Confederation. I mean, and you talked about it when you talked about the fur trade and others. Canada, as an entity, has been here a very, very long time, and if you talk about the Indigenous people, it goes back even further, but we fixated on that 150 number versus another.
Yes, because that's when all the different colonies came together, and our government system and the Canadian Federation was established in 1867. But I think that my own sense of sort of 1967 was a wonderful party, and everybody had a terrific time, and Expo was extraordinary, and 5 times the number of visitors expected arrived. And I remember reading a piece by Margaret Atwood. She said, at the end of that year, at the end of 1967, we all looked at each other and said, we did it. We survived. Suddenly Canada had arrived and felt that the world had seen this country. 50 years later, it's a very different country from the Canada of 1967, which was frankly sort of still in the Moody Innis outlook of thinking it was a British, an offshoot of Britain which had a lot of geography. It was today that paradigm doesn't hold at all. And as soon as there was a suggestion that we should be celebrating the BNA Act in 1867, everybody looked at the terrible flaws of that act, and particularly, of course, the fact that Indigenous peoples, whose voices are now at last being heard in political debates, were totally marginalized. So it's a more complicated country with more voices being heard, with the flaws of the BNA Act being recognized, and it's also a stronger country. You don't have to spend the whole time saying, we did it, we survived. Canada knows it can do that.
So we're just mature now.
I think so.
That's good.
Your books range over an extraordinary variety of subjects. I mean, you talked about some already: Suzanne Moody, Alexander Graham Bell, Jack London, Nellie McClung, 1915 murder trial here in Toronto. How do you choose what you're going to write about? Where does that come from?
Usually something catches my attention, and I I mean, I am a writer, not a historian, and I always rush to say that because historians, you know, my good friend Tim Cook, the military historian, we went for a walk the other day, and he's now, in the last 7 years, published 5 books on the First World War. And so he has this, you know, I mean, his depth of knowledge is extraordinary. He's called the Great War historian because he writes about the Great War. I always want to know why can't I be about the great women's historian, because I write about great women, but apparently women don't get to be great. But I don't feel that my first priority is scholarship in the way that a university or museum-based historian is. I feel that my great interest is finding fascinating stories and then using them to entice readers to not only enjoy my books, but also to come away saying, I learned something about my country. And so obviously I'm going to sort of just be like a jackdaw looking for the shiny bits where, you know, there's some terrific event like the Gold Rush. But through a book about the Gold Rush in the Yukon in the 1890s, I can actually tell you quite a lot about what was happening in terms of the Canadian economy at that point, the extraordinary geography of what it was like to cross a continent where the railway had only been there for 10 years, that I can tell you a little about the individual backgrounds of people who went on the Gold Rush, and I hope, give you a sense that you can see, smell, feel, hear what it was to live back then.
I'm fascinated how you do this in that, I mean, when you look at your book, you're looking at the top of the iceberg, there's all the bits underneath, and there must be lots of rabbit holes and other things that you follow down. So do you ever get overwhelmed with the stuff you're finding, or do you store that away for something else, or does that slow you down, or do you know how to just throw that to the side?
I've learned how to be sort of fairly laser-visioned on this is the story I want to tell, and not to be too distracted by extraneous details. But I have also learned that sometimes I will be in the archives. I remember with my first book, which was about Mrs. King, William Lyon Mackenzie King's mother, and I was reading all this family correspondence, and I was sort of looking particularly at what it was like to live in Toronto in the early 20th century, not very far from here actually, on Beverly Street. And I was looking particularly for domestic details. I would be reading all the correspondence and taking notes furiously about anything that was related to my interests. And then I'd wake up in the night and think, why did I ignore that extraordinary sentence that Isabel Mackenzie King wrote about something that had nothing to do with my priority at that moment, but it was about her attitude to Americans or her fears for her son. Why did I ignore it? And I would realize that actually that was such a good story, and that it played into another theme that I could develop, and then I'd have to go back to the archives in Canada, in Ottawa, because I was reading all this on microfilm, and wind the microfilm back and try and remember exactly where I'd seen that particular reference. So in general, I'm pretty disciplined in terms of staying with my themes, but I have to be careful not to be too disciplined, because I might miss the gems.
It's more of a publishing industry kind of question now for you. So you're predominantly write nonfiction. I mean, maybe some of it's fictionalized, we don't know because we don't have all the details for everything. But
It's not fictionalized.
But let's go with it's all nonfiction. And in some parts of the world, nonfiction is really, really hot. I mean, it's what's if you go to the bookshops in the UK and other places, you're overwhelmed by the number of nonfiction titles, and that hasn't happened here yet. Why do you think that is?
I find it very frustrating. I find that fiction is enormously well respected in Canada. I think, you know, we have a wonderful, vibrant literary culture with great novels, but two things has happened. The first is that creative writing schools, which are sort of exploding on every campus, as far as I can see, they all privilege fiction above non-fiction. All the students who go into those want to write short stories, find a publisher, and then publish their first novel. It's never suggested to them that literary skills can also be appropriate in non-fiction. The other thing is that in this country, we're just losing all our magazines. I mean, we still have Walrus, but I used to write for Saturday Night, gone. When I first arrived, I wrote for a magazine called Weekend, and there was another one called Canadian, gone. The magazines, now there is no, and those magazines, in fact, were my sort of graduate school in nonfiction writing, because they were terrific editors, and that's where I learned how to put together a 5,000-word profile of a cabinet minister, with, editors who were brutal. They told me that my lead was wrong, my conclusion was wrong, my sentences were too long. That they really helped me shape my prose. Younger writers have very little opportunity to do that now because those outlets don't exist. So it annoys me because I think that we're not training when there aren't the opportunities for non-fiction writers that there are for fiction writers. And they're not being rewarded either. I mean, you and I were at the Writers' Trust Awards yesterday, and there are awards there for writers in mid-career, sort of lifetime achievement awards. They're always for fiction writers. There's no such thing for non-fiction writers.
That did not cheer me up much. I'm almost done now. I don't know what to say. Let's go back to last night, though. So, I mean, the Journey Prize, which is for a short story, and was in a magazine, and then was collected for the Journey Prize. That prize was funded by James A. Michener for the book he wrote, Alaska. And my understanding is Journey was sort of the Canadian bit that didn't fit in, and it became a separate standalone book. So I'm almost going to go back to my last question. Do you have things like that lying around? Do you have things that could be a standalone, smaller?
Yes, I do have sort of stories that are sort of cul-de-sacs, were research cul-de-sacs, which I just couldn't stop going down, even though I knew that it was not relevant to the story of Alexander Graham Bell, for example. They're in a file in my office filing cabinet called Other Ideas.
It's going to be an interesting filing cabinet, I'm sure. I know we have opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Is there microphones? Do I share my microphone, or does that work? Oh, I magically see a microphone at the back of the room there. Are there any questions? I see a question there.
Yes. Given that you're admitted that you're a writer, not an historian, you featured a slide and obviously focused on geography, of course. And it reminds me of Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, saying we have too much geography and too little history. But I found the slide that you showed to be extremely ironic, to put it mildly, given the positions that you took apropos of Victoria, BC in particular, being highly critical of Victoria current city coat of arms. The map you showed, fish boats, fishing's gone. No industry, no mines, no high tech, no manufacturing. I don't think I saw any farms portrayed as well. And I saw igloos in the Northwest Territories. So, I mean, historical amnesia, that's not the Canada that I know of and that I'm aware of in 2018. So how would you like to respond to that, given that you were so critical of an official city coat of arms as being, colonial and imperialistically derived and all of that?
So this was the second slide I showed.
Correct.
Which was just saying, how can I understand this country with all this geography, 5 time zones? I think
No people.
No people. Actually, I will tell you
The lighthouse, which have been automated mostly in Canada too by now.
But many of them do still stand. even if they're no longer in use or they've been automated. You know, I owe you an apology. I will look at that slide again, because what I did was I was just trying to. I can tell you, if you'd come from a different country, Canada is huge. And I think many Canadians often find themselves for the first time going to Yellowknife or traveling to northern Alberta and sort of saying, I can't believe how long it takes to get here. It's the size of the country, and trying to sort of pack a book about it or find a story that relates to the whole country, coast to coast to coast, when there's such diversity, that I was trying to illustrate with that particular slide. It's one that I will actually now alter and look at more closely, because it was certainly not meant to tell a story in itself about whether I think this country is entirely composed of igloos and natural beauty and no extractive industries. I will say, though, that when I first arrived in Canada, I flew from Ottawa to Saskatchewan, to Saskatoon, and for some reason we were flying very low, and I looked down, and I'd come from England, and I looked down. There were no roads, there were no communities, there were no. I found it stunning. It's very, and I found reading Suzanne Moody's first comments on when she arrives, and she's in the St. Lawrence and she doesn't realize it's a river. How can this possibly be a river? British rivers are about sort of 50 meters across at most. That it's the vastness that I was trying to convey.
Another comment on that map. It cut off Toronto and southern Ontario, and I thought you were trying to make us look like, realize that there's more to the country than just the center of the universe that we currently inhabit here.
That wasn't deliberate, but I'm happy to hear it.
I want to get away from the map. I was intrigued by your story of how you would not topple the statue of Sir John A., and that we need to look at the context in which people lived and so on in evaluating their contributions to a country. Is that always true, or do you have some people where you would think, no, you'd absolutely take their statues down? What about those Confederate statues, or anybody else?
I think it has to be on a case-by-case basis. You can't possibly sort of just do a generalized, they must topple. You know, I mean, I've just been in Portugal. There isn't a single statue of Salazar, the dictator, visible anywhere. And of course, you know, you'll never see any reference to, any statue reference to Adolf Hitler in Germany. In Russia, apparently, there are fields filled with Spanish Stalins. So a statue is not just an image of a person, it's also a celebration of them. And there are some people, you know, some individuals from the past who under no circumstances should we be celebrating. Anybody who whose whole career was dedicated to white supremacy, for example. So the Confederate generals, which was such an emotional issue in, I think it's Charlottesville, those generals, not only were they fighting to defend the institution of slavery, so in itself, there's no reason to celebrate them for a minute. But those statues were actually put up 50 years after the Civil War, at a period when of really appalling sort of treatment of African Americans. And it was a deliberate attempt to reassert Confederate values. So I was really happy to see them toppling, and particularly because you really got the sense of history calling out from the past because of that terrible demonstration where there were neo-Nazis shouting racial, bigoted statements, and you think, that's why the statues have to go. Similarly with Cecil Rhodes, which at Oxford has been a huge issue of whether a statue there of Cecil Rhodes should be removed. And I had no problem when it was removed because, again, you know, Cecil Rhodes was a British imperialist who was dedicated to ensuring that the colonies in southern Africa should remain run by whites. On the other hand, there's the Gandhi Must Go campaign in Ghana, because Gandhi had views, had made some statements about black Africans, which were deeply racist. But with somebody like Gandhi, I mean, is one going to negate his whole legacy because of statements he made that reflect, in fact, not just the views at the time, but the fact that he'd studied law in the British Inns of Courts, where such statements were just par for the course. And he went on, as we know, to be a man that, for instance, Nelson Mandela said did more for decolonization than anybody else. So it has to be case by case, but I'm absolutely not dogmatic, that statues have to stay where they are.
First of all, thank you. Is this on? Okay. Sorry. First of all, thank you very much for coming and for your talk. It was very interesting. Although, again, I'm going to take issue with the statues. Not with the statues themselves, but more with the idea that we can't acknowledge both parts of it, that he was very important to the Foundation of Canada, the railway, for John A. Macdonald, as well as being as being racist.
I don't disagree with that for a minute. And I was on a committee at the Museum of History in Ottawa when they were redoing the History Hall. I don't. If you have an opportunity to go, you must. It's really fascinating. And Macdonald appears in two sections of that. One in terms of his role in the establishment of Confederation, where he is seen as the nation builder, and one in terms of his role in terms of residential schools. And there's a big quote on the panel there talking about starving Indigenous people, a deliberate campaign of starvation of Indigenous people. So both sides of him are recognized. I'm not saying for a minute that we revere we leave Macdonald there without contextualizing. All these statues should have far more information than just the names on them.
But I can see a reason for removing them as well, based on that history. And if community by community people decide what to do with them, I think that's something that should be discussed and is a good part of it. It's because it's still a part of our history, both the statue and also what's done with it.
What do you mean, is it still a part of our history?
No, I'm confirming that it is still a part of our history.
Okay.
Not a question, a statement. And you pointed out the coat of arms, and it was standing for civilization and something, colonization. So I think you make an excellent point about that, and that is just highlighting another thing we should probably address and change, rather than suggesting that there's some sort of problem with doing one or the other. It's like, well, if that's what that's supposed to stand for, then yes, let's address that too. I don't see why it can't be an and rather than like an or kind of situation.
I don't disagree. I think I use that example of the coat of arms just to explain that wrenching Macdonald out of context is to not explaining exactly what was going on in that period, which was so different from ours in terms of their views on land, on empire, on Indigenous people, on racial hierarchies. I mean, views that are intolerable today, but we have to try and understand, even as we we should be explaining rather than eliminating our history.
I 100% agree with that, but at the same time, I don't think we need a statue of the man to do that. And the symbol that he plays in a larger context in Canada versus the BC Town Hall thing, which people may or may not know, I can see, again, it has a much more prominent place in the Canadian imagination than that particular symbol would. So I can see why it would be upsetting to people, and people would want to have it removed.
To have it removed. I think, well, actually, the funny thing is that in some circumstances, I think it's appropriate to remove MacDonald's name. The Canadian Historical Association, as I mentioned, had renamed their award for a book from the MacDonald Award to being award for the best book on Canadian history. And I read the debates that they had on that, and I agreed that, in fact, if you call it the MacDonald Award, you're really sort of suggesting that a version of history in which he is an unflawed hero is, it's too unquestioned of his legacy given our circumstances today. So I think that, you could justify removing his name from that particular award. Wiping out the statues, I don't agree with, because I'd much rather see them prompt this kind of debate.
Why not place them in galleries or museums instead of on street corners? Like, there's other positioning
Oh,
that
yes,
you could use
the
to
other-
maintain the history of it.
And the other thing you can do is to have a statue of him and add a new statue of an Indigenous leader next to him so that you get some kind of contrast.
Sorry, there's muttering behind me. I think somebody wants me to move on from this, but we'll agree to disagree.
I've been getting some secret hand signals, which indicates we're out of time. I'd hoped we'd had time for more questions, but the good thing is I know you're going to be, is it a quick question?
As long as it's not about the map.
Make this quick. It's a quick question and maybe a quick answer. I don't know. But you mentioned the title of your talk was about historical amnesia, and there was actually a Canadian magazine, this magazine, that recently published an article about social media being responsible for the issue of historical amnesia. Technology, and nowadays nobody's interested in history. It's all about the current. Just wondering what your take on that hypothesis is.
Social media is such a huge issue in terms of how it's reshaping our world, our knowledge, our access to information, our debate. I mean, what it's doing to history is only part of the larger issue. What it's doing to contemporary politics is equally worrying, and how it's being manipulated is just plain scary. So it may be a simple question. I haven't got an answer.
I would like to now welcome Alice Liu, the chair of the History Students Association, to come up.
Hi everyone. As you just heard, my name is Alice and I'm the president of the History Students Association. And I have the honor of thanking Charlotte Gray for taking the time to come here from Ottawa and give this very important and very thought-provoking lecture. As a history student, I know that the question of how to view history, and especially how to view controversial and darker parts of history, is a very robust and contemporary debate, as I think our question and answer period showed. But through your lecture and through your books, you've really provided some important and thoughtful insights into how we can view this debate and how we can view our history and our stories. Through this lecture, for example, you really brought the stories of Suzanne Moody and Harold Innis to life, and you really showed how their circumstances influenced their views and their perceptions of Canada. And through that, you brought the story of Canada to life and inspired, I'm sure, many people in this audience to think about our country in a new way and to think about different perspectives and different stories about this country. And mentioned in the Q&A that you wanted people to to read your books and to think after they're finished, that they learn something new about this country that we all live in. And I think that through this lecture, we've all learned something about Canada, and for that, we thank you. I'm going to stop talking. I know this is kind of brief, but I know that everyone must be really excited about the food, and I will mention that you also brought the stories of Canada and of many Canadians to life in a humorous and thoughtful way. And for that, we thank you for your very thought-provoking and very interesting lecture. The History Students Association, Harold Innis Foundation, Innis College, and I'm sure everyone in the audience, thanks you again for coming and taking the time.